Steely Dan Gold on cassette. We're going to actually disassemble this cassette so you can kind of see what's on the inside of this today. You know, when I was in Denver last time, I was at Wax Trax and I found this little cassette and I thought it'd be fun to open it up, make one of these little videos. And anyway, I didn't become aware of Steely Dan until the soundtrack of Heavy Metal, if you remember that movie. Donald Fagen had a song on there. Actually, it's on this tape. It's called True Companion. And I was in the 1980s when that came out, I was kind of a heavy metal kid. And I was really into, like, the song Heavy Metal by Sammy Hagar. I loved that stuff. And I was into all the heavy metal stuff at the time. I actually, the first time I was introduced to Black Sabbath was on the Heavy Metal soundtrack with the song Mob Rules. And so I'm listening to all this and even the Don Felder song Heavy Metal still, even though it had an Eagles sound, it still sounded kind of heavy, right? And then Open Arms was on there, which was a little weird. And then I came across this Donald Fagen song, and I got to be honest with you, I didn't get it. I was just a young teenage kid, young guy, and it made no sense to me. I saw the movie in the theater. It was a midnight movie, and I don't know. I didn't care much for it, but the soundtrack was amazing. Anyway, so I saw this. I heard this Donald Fagen song. I didn't understand it. I didn't get the style. It made no sense to me. And it wasn't until years later, and I didn't realize that he was in Steely Dan, that he was the songwriter. Him and Walter Becker had put that. It wasn't until I was an older guy that I started to appreciate it. And of course, like a lot of people, I knew the song Reelin in the Years. Everybody's heard that song. I mean, huge hit. And then Do It Again was a big hit. And then, I don't know when it was, but it was some time ago. I used to be a professional musician, and I got asked to come sing for a while for a Steely Dan tribute band. And I didn't know a lot about them. And so they sent me a song list of all the things I needed to learn. And this is when it fascinated me, because I was going through and I was listening to some of these songs like Peg. And I go, oh, that's Steely Dan? I knew that song. And then Black Friday. Oh, that's Steely Dan? And it was just, again, a really amazing song. And then My Old School, and then the list goes on. And you start realizing how many really, really amazing songs were Steely Dan. And they were kind of musicians. I mean, these guys, as a guitar player and a musician myself, these guys were the real deal. I mean, they were super hyper talented players and songwriters. And what made them pretty interesting was how they introduced kind of jazz chords and jazz progressions. And there's really nobody that did it like they did it. You can point to some other bands that were these really great musicians, but they didn't have that jazz influence that Fagen and Becker put together in this music. And it was just incredible what they did. Anyway, this is kind of a best of tape. Had, let's see, what did it have on it? It had Hey 19, great song, Golden Earrings. That's such a great tune. Kind of that funky sound. Anyway, there's a lot of really cool stuff on this album, and the one True Companion. Oh, and then this one's like a deluxe edition or something. It had Bodhisattva, a live version of that. We used to play that song too. FM, great tune. Yeah, again, you'd hear all these songs when I got with this group, and I started going, oh my gosh, all this stuff is Steely Dan. I didn't realize what a big impact these guys had on popular music. And again, introducing something that was so different into popular music. So I want to take this apart, because a lot of people don't know what these things look like inside. And we've made a few videos with different tapes, but this one's going to be kind of interesting because it's a clear case, or the shell is clear. It's written, they have it imprinted in white on here, and it's against this black background. And that black background is actually not part of the plastic. And when we take this apart, you'll see what I'm talking about. You can see all the little things that make up a tape like this. So, and a lot of tapes that you buy that were produced by record companies didn't have they were sealed shut, glued shut. This one actually had the screws. That's what kind of made me interested in it when I opened it up, and I thought, oh, this will be a fun one to open up because you can actually do it without breaking it. So most tapes like this have 5 screws, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the corners, and then there's usually a 5th one right there. And an interesting thing right off the bat with this tape, most of the time, the side that has the screws is considered side 1 or side A. In this case, it's actually side 2 that has the screws. So I'm going to go ahead and take these out. Again, there's 5 screws here. And here at the studio, we have a company here. My company is called Audio Mover, and what we do is we convert people's cassette tapes, audio and video tapes, to digital. And we don't do this kind of tape because it's copyrighted, but we get things sent in from all over the country, churches, government agencies, people that just have recordings of things, and people send it in. And so we actually open things up quite a bit like this, simply because we get a lot of the tapes that come into the studio are broken, and we have to open them and get in and fix them. And I'll show you a couple of the things. So you remove those screws, and usually it'll just lift off very easily, just like that. Now, the first thing that's kind of interesting, when I told you that on the inside here, that black, you can see it a little more clearly as I put it over a colored background there, that black is not part of the tape, and it's actually this little gasket, and I'll remove it so you can see this. That little gasket right there keeps the tape, the actual oxide tape, the audio tape, from rubbing on the plastic. So that's what that's there for. And this particular one, and you see that it's a little different looking. It'd be harder against like a white background. It'd be harder to read without this in there, obviously. So, but what's interesting about it, and you can see it on this one, you'll see that it's kind of ridged. It has this very subtle embossing on it. You can see that there's kind of one along the bottom, a couple along the top. And what that does is the gasket itself keeps it from rubbing on the shell, but that little bit of embossing, see if you can understand this, because it pokes out that way just a tiny little bit, you can see that it's just ridged out just a little bit. What that does is it puts this very, very light pressure on the tape as it's spooling and kind of sandwiches it in just that extra little bit so that it spools onto the reel smoother. It's a very simple thing, but it adds, it's just enough so it doesn't impede it from turning, but it just keeps it kind of, because these reels, unlike a reel-to-reel tape, like if you go into our studio and you see the reel-to-reel machines, the reels actually have sides on them, because they're open reels. This doesn't, obviously. The reel itself is the tape, but that extra little, this gasket right here, which is on both sides, you'll see there's one right there too, again, just gives it that extra little bit of pressure so that it spools on smoothly. Okay. Now, of course, here we have the tape. We have the 2 reels, and then what you'll see here right off the bat is you'll see that the tape right here is blue. It's kind of a clear blue. And what this is, and it's on the beginning of pretty much any audio tape you ever look at, it's called leader tape. And you can't record on that. It's basically just a little thin piece of plastic. And there's usually, I don't know, a foot or so. Never really measured it, and I don't know that there's a consistent length. But what you'll see here is as it goes, eventually it will attach to the oxide tape right there. And this is the side with the audio right there, and this on the other side isn't. And the way you can tell very easily, the color you can't tell, but you can see just by looking at the way they have the 2 things put together. This tape, which connects the leader with the actual oxide tape, is always on the inside, right there. So that then on the outside here, this is the side that goes across the playhead when you're listening to this tape. It'll rub against that, like the playhead will kind of go into the tape like this and push it, and then the tape goes across it like so, and that's how it reads the magnetic signal that's coming off of the tape, the oxide. So anyway, so then these reels, as you can see, they just lift right out of there, and it's very easy when you start working with these things for them to get you can see right here they get so messy really fast. They just start coming all over. The leader's always a little more sturdy, and then the further, when you get into the oxide, it just kind of, it flips and flops around, and it can get very hard to work with, especially the longer the tape is. So for example, if you used tapes like this back in the day, a 60-minute tape and a 120-minute tape, they all fit in the same shell. Well, how did they do that, really, when you have twice as much tape? Well, the only way they could do is just make the tape thinner. And the thinner and thinner and thinner it would get, the harder it is to work with. And if you ever worked with a little micro cassette, the kind that we used to have in like a telephone answer machine, I've had to repair those before, and that is a full-on nightmare. They are so thin, and it just flips and it's so hard to work with. And anyway, so you can take these out, and you can see also one other kind of interesting thing. These were all done a little bit differently, but you can see how it's attached to the reel right there. This leader tape. You can see that little different color right there, that white. What that is it's kind of a little post. There's a hole, a little round hole that's in the reel. They put the leader down in there, and then they pushed this little white post in there, and that's what holds it to the reel, like so. And it is a really solid connection there. These come in different shapes and sizes, the way they would attach these to the reels. They had some that were larger, but they all kind of fit in there with pressure. This was probably the best, in my opinion. The kind that were a little bigger, what would happen to those over time as the plastic breaks down through photo degradation or what have you, and it yellows, it would actually, just because it was under a little bit of pressure, it would break. And we get tapes in here fairly regularly where that has broken, and we have to open it up and literally we have a little bag filled with these things to reattach on tapes as they come in. So, because that is kind of an issue over time. So you'll see this one has the same kind of gasket right there. And then this is another thing, and these are a little different in different types of tapes, but you'll also see there's some little wheels right here. And in some cases, like here, that's part of the plastic injection mold for the tape itself, or the shell. But a lot of times what they do, instead of having that, is they'll just have a little divot, and then they have a little piece of metal, a post that goes into that divot, and then the reels sit over that. Either way, this reel that sits on there is supposed to be able to spin freely. You can kind of see right there how it spins, and then the tape goes around it, and it just helps guide it through. And they were fairly consistent how the tapes worked on the inside, but there's a variety of them. As you watch some of the other videos that we have here taking tapes apart, you can see they're all a little bit different. So there's a couple other things here that are kind of interesting. This is a little magnetic shield that just sits right there in the shell. And part of the point there is when you're recording or playing back a tape, there's literally a magnetic field going on right there. And with the playhead, because when it comes up and it's reading the magnetic signal, and right next to the playhead, there's usually an extra little one. I'll have to make a video about it. That's an erase head. So what happens when you're recording on a cassette tape, you're not just recording onto the cassette tape, you're actually erasing it while you record onto it. That's why if you ever had a cassette tape and you recorded over something, what's happening when you hit record on your tape player is it would actually engage two different things. And one of them was the record head that would put the magnetic signal onto the oxide tape. And there was also another little thing right next to it called an erase head. And as the tape passed over it, it would literally erase what was on there, so that you could record something else onto it. If the erase head was disabled, it would just keep recording over and over and over. And when you recorded over something, you would just add to whatever was on there. You wouldn't actually erase the other thing. Anyway, just kind of an extra little thing. The recording over something did not necessarily imply you would erase the other stuff. The only reason it did is because pretty much every tape deck had that little thing built into it, the erase head. Now, the other thing that you'll see here is this little thing called a pressure pad that's on this little piece of copper, the pressure pad mount. And what this did is it enabled you to get a solid connection between the tape and the playhead. So when this is in there, what's supposed to happen is the tape would go across this little pressure pad here, and when you pushed play or record, the head would come up and push like that, and this little thing would just have a little bit of give. And because it's because it gives and it bends, it would just add that little bit of pressure so that the oxide tape, as it was going across the head, would have a nice solid connection, and it would be able to pick up the magnetic signal off of the tape very smoothly into the playhead. And what happens a lot of times is when tapes come into the studio, that little piece of felt falls off over time. And it just depended. Some tape manufacturers were worse than others. This one, obviously, I don't know when this tape was made, but it's actually lasted pretty well. But we'll get projects where we'll open up a case that a tape might be in. Again, we don't do this kind, but we still get tapes in cases a lot. And what'll happen is you'll open it up, you'll take the tape out. One of the first things we check for is to make sure that little pad is in place, and we'll look at the tape and it's not, and then we'll look in here and it's sitting right in there. And it may be if you still play tapes, and if a tape's not sounding good, part of the reason is because you're not making a solid connection. Now, some tape formulas, the oxide, lasted longer than others. This one actually looks like it's in pretty good shape, but some of them just ever so slightly, they get brittle and they warp a little bit. And because of that really helps when you have this little pressure pad, because it takes that slight warp in the tape and it just keeps it flat against the playhead. And it makes sure that you have a nice sound, a nice connection. And so, like I said, there's the gasket. And so there's actually quite a few pieces in a cassette tape. You've got just the two shells, you've got a couple of gaskets, you've got the reels, the little post that goes in there, these things, the wheels, you've got the little piece of copper, the mount. I got to set this back in. There you go. You've got the little magnetic shield there. And again, because there's a magnetic signal being generated here, what they're trying to do is keep that signal from, when you have other oxide tape literally just a half an inch or a quarter inch in some cases away from this little erase head, it can potentially damage or impact the audio that's on this tape. And any tape can be damaged. Matter of fact, the only reason, like you could record over this tape, the only reason, you might recall that a lot of tapes you'd buy at a store, you'd hit record and it wouldn't let you, and that's because these holes that are right there in the top, you'll see it right there. Well, it's hard to tell when I put it back together, but these were these tabs. If you bought a tape to record on, those tabs would be in there, and as soon as you broke them out, then it would prevent you from recording on the tape. And all you'd have to do is put some tape, just some Scotch tape or something over the top of those, put it in your tape deck, and then it would allow you to record. So you can damage, just because it was manufactured by a record company doesn't mean you couldn't damage it in some way or record over it. And a lot of people actually did that. We actually sometimes see tapes that people send into the studio where they've taken an old tape like this and they've just recorded a birthday party over the top of it or something like that, which you can, again, all these tapes will act just like a blank tape that you buy for the purpose of recording over, and all you have to do is just put a thing over those over those little record protect holes. So I'm going to put it back together. This can be a little bit challenging sometimes because the oxide tape does flip around so much. And what I usually do is by the way, if you ever open one of these things up and mess with it, I usually wash my hands really, really good before I do it, because you have oils and things all over your fingers, and you don't really want to touch all this stuff with those oils. And so I've tried doing it with gloves, and it's just so hard. So I usually what I'll do is I'll just kind of set my finger very lightly over the edge right there, you'll see, and then as I turn it, it'll just help it stay on the reel while I try to get it spooled back up. So now I'm getting that spooled back up. And as I said, this can the leader's a little easier to work with because it's a little thicker. So whenever I'm opening a tape up or working on it, I always make sure it's rewound or fast forwarded to one end or the other, because working with the actual oxide tape can be really messy. And a lot of the breaks that we have to repair are right there, because again, where the oxide tape and the leader meet, that's really just being held together. As I showed you, it's really just a piece of tape, like tape. I know when I say tape, I'm talking about the tape and sticky tape. Basically, it's, for all intents and purposes, it's kind of like a little piece of Scotch tape, just holding the two things together. And like if you've seen a piece of Scotch tape after 20, 30 years, it just deteriorates and just falls off. And that will happen with a lot of cassette tapes that get sent into the studio. What happens is they played it and it was broken, and all that really happened was that connection, just because the adhesive wore off after years, that was it. And so we have to open it up and then go in and make that little repair. And I have a bunch of videos, and I'm sure we'll make more, where we show how to do that. So now I'm just putting all this back together. And it's interesting, most of the time these gaskets just kind of, there's no adhesive on them, but they just kind of stick. And so then the trick here is getting it to go behind oh goodness. You'll see that these little teeth right there has to go behind those. And it's not, sometimes it just goes on real smooth and no problem, and other times it takes a second to get it lined up and to set. There you go. Sets on there very nicely. Putting our Steely Dan tape back together. Gonna put these screws back in. And again, these guys, and Donald Fagen still, as I understand, I think he's still touring as Steely Dan. And that, I tell you, I loved that the band I was in, it was a full-on, like, I think we had 13, it was a 13-piece band or something. I was so lucky to get to do that for a while, because they had a full horn section, and man, playing all that stuff. We even did a few Tower of Power songs as well, and it was so much fun. And the music was so great, and to be able to play with people that can actually execute on that stuff, you know, these things that were played by these guys that were just so good. They were so talented. And anyway, so I thought this would be kind of fun to show you what this thing is all about. And you also see, kind of interestingly on this tape, one of the unique things they did, and you know, so many different manufacturers would do this different, those little dots right there. You know, I've noticed in the comments in a lot of the videos we make, people talk about tapes and what it was like, and part of the thing that a lot of kids don't appreciate was the need to fast forward and rewind to find a song. I mean, there was music scanning eventually that allowed you to forward, and it would look for silent spots and it would find them and stop and play. But for the most part, with cassettes, you were just forwarding and rewinding, trying to find that spot where the song started. And the way we would gauge these things is, of course, you had the little number readout on the cassette player. But if you put the tape in and it was already halfway through the tape, you didn't know where it was, you were resetting that thing, you would sometimes just have these little dots to go by, and you'd know, okay, well, that song starts right about when the tape gets to that dot. Anyway, it's kind of funny, the old way we used to do this stuff. Anyway, so there you go. That's what it looks like on the inside of Steely Dan Gold. Thought you'd like that. Of course, be sure and like and subscribe and leave any comments if you like this stuff, if you had an old tape, if you still have old tapes, just like to hear your feedback about all that. And with that, of course, have yourself a fantastic day.